we were stagnating on many dimensions, then you would conclude that maybe we can't just do business as usual. If you do business as usual, you're saying that the younger generation should expect to have lives less good than their parents. You'd expect that the whole sort of middle class compact in our societies, in which young people are expected to do better than their parents, is breaking down, and there's sort of a way that our institutions will not work and will derange. And so I had this idea that something has gone very wrong with progressivism in the science sense, progressivism in the technology sense, that things are not progressing as advertised. And this was not there's obviously normative implications, but to start with, this was just a descriptive question. How fast is science progressing? And we had the tagline we came up with was, they promised us flying cars, all we got was 140 characters, not to downplay the importance of Twitter, and maybe you had to free up Twitter and change it into X to have any chance of getting back to flying cars. But things were stalled on all these areas, and that itself felt like a very taboo question to ask for a long time, because if these institutions were not working, that was a big deal. And this is always a kind of perspective I have on let's say the woke issues, the culture war issues, and things like this. I wrote a book in the 1990s. David Sachs, my friend David Sachs, and I wrote this book, The Diversity Myth, and it was sort of an updated version of a Buckley, God and Man at Yale, sort of a critique of multiculturalism, the politics of intolerance at Stanford University, and sort of what had gone wrong in these college campuses. And we were focused on all these identity politics, political correctness, culture wars issues from 3 decades ago. And there's a way in which it was prophetic, and there's a way in which you don't want it to be prophetic. You want people to listen to you.
Peter, I have a clip.
They didn't listen to us, and then
well, I've got a clip of
we were
you
like Cassandras. We had these warnings.
Yeah, I've got a clip of you talking about that. Let's take a look.
I'll tell you what the problem is with looking for racism everywhere. Because when you start looking for racism everywhere and you start finding racism everywhere, it's only a very small step to finding racists everywhere. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if those racists are really out there, but I'm going to suggest to you that they really aren't. The problems of racism, sexism, other forms of oppression have been vastly exaggerated, and as a result, people get unjustly accused. A culture of complaint leads to a culture of blame.
I mean, apart from the fact you've aged incredibly well, because that's 30
Yes.
years ago, what do you think when you look back at that, Peter Thiel? Because you were bang on.
I'm always a little bit more self-critical. I think I was right about everything, but then I also think I wasn't wrong, but there was a way in which I was not even wrong. And so the question I was not asking was this question I just alluded to about, let's say, scientific and technological progress. There was a way the question of the universities was focused on the humanities, not on the sciences, and maybe one needed to have this much broader critique of what had gone wrong. For example, we just had in the last year and a half we had the university presidents, both Harvard and Stanford, were fired.
Yeah.
Claudine Gay. The Harvard one was the sort of diversity plagiarist black woman, and there's sort of a very straightforward conservative critique you can have of Claudine Gay. But I think equally important was the Mark Tessier-Levine firing at Stanford, who was a old white male neurobiologist, neuroscientist, who, as far as I can tell, had basically engaged in completely fraudulent scientific research, falsified his data, stole tens of millions of dollars from the government. And so the Harvard one was humanities fraud, the Stanford one was science fraud. And I'm not saying the science fraud was more important than the humanities fraud, but they were in some ways different sides of the same coin. And the way the universities often would deal with the question, why are we not studying Shakespeare, why are we not reading the great books, is, well, we're doing science. The science is more important than the humanities. And the broader critique I would have is that it has failed across the board, and that even even these areas of science that were sort of a big part of the early modern project, the atheist liberal project of early modernity, have gotten exhausted and have failed, and this is sort of the extraordinary crisis that we're at, and then of course, there are all these different versions of this one could describe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about the flying cars and things. I mean, I'll give you one example where we clearly haven't moved on. In fact, we've gone backwards fast, and that would be transatlantic travel. I knew the great Sir David Frost, who was the Frost-Nixon fame, and when he was doing a transatlantic show, one in London, one in New York, he used to get Concorde. It used to take 2 hours, 58 minutes to get from London to New York. He'd have breakfast in London, and he'd arrive in time to have breakfast in New York. It now takes me 7 hours to do the same journey, and that's 50 years later. And that's just one little example.
Yeah,
but that's an example of what you're talking about, right?
Sure. Perhaps one of the paradigmatic variations of accelerationism was just faster travel, and it was it went faster every decade from 1500 onwards. It was faster sailing ships, and then in the 19th century it was faster trains, then faster cars, and faster airplanes and jet planes by the 50s and 60s, and then you get the Concorde by the early 70s, and now that's regressed. And in some ways, if you include all the low-tech airport security measures and all these things, it's probably significantly slower than it was in the 1960s. So it's a very dramatic illustration of where things have actually regressed. But I think something like this is true of most areas of what we call science and technology. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford, I was class of '89 undergraduate, late '80s. In retrospect, it wasn't obvious at the time, but in retrospect, almost all engineering fields were bad ones to go into. You should not have gone to chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, aeroastro engineering. There was not going to be that much innovation in that area. You certainly shouldn't have gone into nuclear engineering. I think people had gotten the memo on that by the 1980s. And this world of bits was just not progressing. In electrical engineering, there was still some progress in semiconductors, but really the only field that worked in retrospect was computer science, which in the 1980s was, by the way, a very strange field.
Yeah.
Computer science was something people studied who flunked out of physics and math. And you have to, whenever people use, I'm in favor of science, I'm not in favor of science in scare quotes. And so computer science was like political science or social science or climate science, where the people teaching it had an inferiority complex and called it science because it was not. It was sort of this, and then it was this very strange thing that this was actually the one field that, where there was progress, but it was this narrow cone of progress around computers, software, internet, mobile internet, maybe crypto, maybe AI at this point. And there were some great companies that could be built. People could have successful careers in these areas. It was probably not quite enough to take our civilization as a whole to the next level if we measure it in terms of these day-to-day things like the Concorde travel, or if we measure it in terms of per capita GDP or things like that.
Yeah. You mentioned computer science there. So Google have just announced this Willow quantum chip, which they claim can solve puzzles that would take the fastest supercomputer today 10 septillion years, a number that actually exceeds the age of the universe. I can't get my head around that. Can you?
Well, it's I don't know. There are sort of a lot of different things one could say about computer science. It is an area where there has been some progress. I think we probably shouldn't just dismiss AI. So it's often, like in some ways, it's a symptom of our stagnation, that when we do have progress, we can't even believe that it's real. And so there's probably, I'm not saying that there's been none, but if one asks what the significance of this is, there's a way in which you can try to frame it in terms of this sort of narrow technical question, or we can frame it, metaphysically, maybe tell us something interesting about the nature of the universe. But the intermediate question that I would always like to ask is sort of the social, political, cultural, or even just economic question. How does this translate into higher per capita GDP? How does it translate into better standards of living for people? And that part is maybe there's some way it does, but it's pretty attenuated, pretty weak. That's the suspicion one has.
Is AI going to change the world fantastically well in the end, or is it potentially? I interviewed Professor Stephen Hawking before he died, who said that the biggest threat to mankind, he believed, was when AI learns to self-design, it's all over. Do you share that fear, or do you think it's an exciting, brave new world that will enhance everything?
Well, I suppose utopia and dystopia aren't the only options. I think it is an area where there has been real progress. There's a dimension of it that's quite extraordinary. It's if we had defined the holy grail of computer science for 70, 80 years, it was passing the Turing test. And the Turing test is where you have a computer that can pretend and can fool you into thinking that it's a human being. And it's a little bit of a fuzzy line what the Turing test represents, but it was basically passed by ChatGPT in late 22, early 23. And so that is a very, there is something surely very significant about that. And it has all sorts of repercussions we should think about. I don't know if it straightforwardly leads to utopia or dystopia.
Right.
The negative way I would frame it is there isn't much going on outside of AI, outside of even, let's say, the internet and computers for the last 50 years. And so if we don't get extraordinary progress out of AI, we're not going to get it by recommissioning the Concorde or anything like that. And so probably too much is freighted on AI. And so the way, maybe one way to think about something like the Hawking or all these people, the way they talk about it, they are silently admitting that there's nothing else going on.
Right.
So if we need AI to lead to utopia or dystopia, that's sort of voce. You're admitting there's nothing else going on.
Yeah. I want to play a clip. This is of Elon Musk talking about you.
We've had our disagreements, but we are friends. And I would say for 95% of the time we've known each other, we've been friends.
I bet that 5% was rough, though, knowing both of you.
It was a little rough. Yeah, things got a little bumpy at one point. I think I have more tolerance for risk than Peter does. So I was sort of maybe more kind of pedal to the metal, and Peter was like, well, let's be a little cautious here. He may have been right, actually.
A, is that characterization correct? Do you think he is a bigger risk taker than you? And B, is he also perhaps right that your way is probably more sensible?
I think I certainly would never want to bet against Elon. I would never want to compete head on with Elon. And probably a lot of what he says is correct. Certainly, the Silicon Valley perspective on Elon in the 2000s was that he was starting these two crazy companies. There was Tesla, the car company, and SpaceX, the rocket company. They both sounded super crazy. If only one of them had succeeded, one might still have said that it was just extraordinarily lucky. The fact that to first approximation both have succeeded have wildly succeeded. I always want to say it tells us something that, Elon knows something about risk the rest of us don't. So there's some way, it looks like it's this high wire, crazy risk taking act, and somehow somehow you can't have two companies succeed in such an extraordinary way without actually really not taking as many crazy risks as it looks. And so I don't know. There's the conversation I've had with Elon is what did you know about how do you understand risk in ways that the rest of us don't? And then I think there's something he understands about it we don't. It's hard to articulate. I don't know if he can articulate it, but that's sort of where I'm at today.